The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's AEE member webinar. This is our final webinar for 2019. So thank you all for joining us today. Just a few housekeeping things first as always. Just a quick reminder that if you have questions, you may post those in the questions section of your control panel. We will be addressing questions towards the end of the webinar. We do actually have 3 presenters for you today, so we will wait until all 3 of them are finished and then we'll do a Q&A session. So please post your questions in there as you go along. If you have questions for me directly in technical issues, perhaps audio, please post those in the chat so that we can keep the technical questions and the topical questions separate. I'd appreciate that. And as always, we will follow up within the next 24 to 48 hours with a follow-up email that will give you your certificate of attendance and a link to the recording of today's webinar. So I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Our topic for today is energy policy innovation and its impact on carbon reduction, offshore wind. We have 3 speakers. We have Catherine Lutine, Jeff Keaney, and Kevin Lang. So first of all, let me introduce you to Catherine Lutine. Catherine is a female entrepreneur, a successful innovator, and a pioneer in energy management and sustainability. She has over 30 years of industry experience within the corporate, non-profit, and regulatory environments. She is the founder and the president of Lutine Associates, which is a leading energy management consulting firm that helps public and private sector clients develop and implement proactive energy strategies, better source energy, operate more efficiently, integrate renewable energies, and achieve significant cost savings. With extensive experience in the education, healthcare, and real estate sectors, Lutine Associates has helped drive more than $500 million in savings for its clients. Ms. Lutine is a nationally recognized leader in the energy industry. She's currently a member of the Energy Committee for the Building Owners and Managers Association of Greater New York, that's BOMA, New York, and she is also a member of the Certified Energy Procurement Board for AEE. Catherine serves as the founder and executive director of Consumer Power Advocates, CPA, which helps large institutional nonprofits in the educational and health sectors decrease energy costs through regulatory affairs and programs that shape energy policies in the New York State. Lutine received her MBA and her bachelor's degree in marketing from Farley Dickinson University in New Jersey. So welcome, Ms. Lutine, today. Now, Jeff Keaney. Jeff is Chief Development Officer and General Counsel of Magellan Wind, a developer working on projects off the California and the Mid-Atlantic coasts. Mr. Keaney co-founded Magellan Wind in 2014, and before starting Magellan, he served as outside counsel to the Offshore Wind Development Coalition. While in private practice, he also served as counsel to Blue Water Wind and other offshore wind companies. Mr. Keaney began his career at the U.S. Department of Justice, first as an appellate litigator in the Environment and Natural Resources Division, and later as an attorney advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel. He is a graduate of Haverford College and Yale Law School. Mr. Lang is our next presenter. Mr. Lang is a graduate of the University of Michigan and Albany Law School of Union University. He is a partner with the law firm Couch White LLP in Albany, New York. Mr. Lang formerly worked for the New York Department of Public Service, serving as an assistant counsel, then as managing attorney responsible for regulatory issues involving electric, gas, and water utilities and New York's nuclear industry. He led staff teams on numerous major electric and gas rate cases, the siting of electric generating facilities, and numerous collaborative rulemaking and other administrative proceedings. Mr. Lang also represented the New York Public Service Commission and New York State Board on Electric Generation Siting and the Environment. New York State Board on Electric Generation Siting and the Environment in state and federal judicial proceedings. Mr. Lang's practice is now focused on representing private and public entities on energy and utility regulatory issues. Mr. Lang represents clients in electric and gas rate cases, general policy cases, and many other administrative proceedings before state and federal regulators. He is active in matters involving the competitive wholesale markets and represents clients in matters before state and federal regulatory agencies and the New York Independent System Operator. He assists clients in evaluating energy procurement options, asset divestitures and acquisitions, and other commercial transactions. In particular, Mr. Lang works extensively with the City of New York on developing and implementing its energy policies. Mr. Lang's practice also includes the representation of clients in judicial reviews of administrative decisions, commercial disputes, and other litigation matters in state and federal court. So welcome to our three presenters today, and thank you for being here today and presenting to our AEE members. At this point, I am going to go ahead and pass control over to Ms. Lutine.
Hi, everyone. It's Catherine Lutine. So, why the topic? The reason why I picked energy policy innovation is because we have this goal where we need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and as much energy efficiency as we can do, and the individual goals of corporations and facilities that most of you are managing, if there isn't a statewide goal or regional goal to reduce emissions, some sort of mandate, us being able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to the point where we're going to reverse climate change is going to be a pretty steep hurdle. So, and one of the ways that we can actually reach that goal is offshore wind. I think it really could be a major solution to reduce carbon emissions. Now, up until maybe 5 years ago, maybe longer, most offshore wind projects were in Europe and Asia. Asia right now is beginning to lead the pack, believe it or not. Predominantly Europe, but Asia's catching up. And those two continents are still leading the pack for offshore wind. But what you're going to hear today from our presenters is that in coastal areas of the United States and in the Northeast, where electric costs are high, offshore wind is more viable. The emerging offshore wind industry in the U.S. faces two, and I stole this from Magellan. So Jeff, I was actually looking at your website, and I thought that this one sentence really summed it all up. The emerging offshore wind industry in the U.S. faces two major challenges: regulatory uncertainty, because just because you can put something in law doesn't mean that that law might change in the near future, and the cost of electricity. So again, where you're seeing most of the development is where, electric costs are high. The latest really is in New York, which where I saw New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act called for 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035, which I thought was a lot. And 1,700 megawatts were contracted in 2019. So in July, the law passed. We already have 1,700 megawatts contracted, and a comparable amount is expected in 2020. Two Scandinavian companies were selected in July to build the 880 megawatt Sunrise and 860 megawatt Empire projects. The net present value of these contracts are $2.2 billion. Similar activities are occurring in New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that from Mr. Lang. The cost to bring offshore power ashore and then to customers themselves will be significant, potentially rivaling the cost of the turbines themselves or more. Who will build this transmission and who will pay for it? In most cases, right now, this is uncertain. We have a wind developer as a panel member, Jeff of Magellan Wind, to explain how offshore wind can be a key factor in reducing carbon. And what he's going to do is, and I really wanted him on the panel, he's going to talk to you all about current deployments, the short and long-term potential, as well as key technology issues. So the technology is kind of interesting. There could be floating or fixed installations. There are radio versus ocean grid transmission options. He's also really going to talk about the cost of offshore wind and how it's really coming down as more and more of it's being built. You'll also hear from another panel member, Kevin Lang, who honestly, I've known this gentleman for at least 20 years, maybe longer. We've sat in many rooms together arguing for interests that are in common. He represents both the city of New York as well as upstate industrial and commercial customers. He's going to focus on transmission considerations. The regulatory maze, it's not really easy building something like this. And he's also going to talk about at least how in New York, there's a state agency purchasing this resource. And I would like to turn this over to Kevin. Oh, Jeff.
Thank you. Let me see if I've got control here. I don't think my, can you see my deck?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'll start right in with the scope of the industry. This is Jeff Keaney from Magellan Wind. As was stated, we're about 5 years old now. Been most active in California, but we're also active in other parts of the U.S. Our specialty from the beginning has been floating offshore wind. That was a strategic decision on our part because we were starting up as developers with a lot of competition already on the fixed bottom side, and we thought it was an open forum, and originally did a lot of work with Statoil, now Equinor, because they had the first floating offshore wind turbine in the world off of Norway, the first commercial scale turbine. Subsequently, we've teamed up with another foundation technology developer called CCL Offshore Technologies. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the floating side, but that's basically the short history of Magellan Wind. What's happened over the last 28 years with offshore wind is a story not unlike other renewable resources, not unlike solar PV. A concomitant increase in deployment and a fairly regular learning curve relationship between installed capacity and price. It's been a little bumpy with offshore wind, partly I think because of some policy missteps in Europe in the early years, but more recently it's been a fairly well-behaved cost curve with a regular relationship between increases in installed capacity on the log scale and decreases in price on the log scale. And this first slide just shows the rapid growth over the last 2 decades to a point now where at the end of 2018 we reached 22 gigawatts and change of installed capacity globally. Almost all of that is in Europe, but as was indicated, China is coming on quickly. There are a lot of projects in the pipeline also in Korea and Taiwan and Japan. But China is driving the Asian market right now. Actually, it's not much of a market for outsiders because it's hard to break in for outside developers and outside equipment manufacturers. But Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan are a different story. The important point here is just that the costs and the accelerating deployments are related, feed off of each other. This is an NREL effort. The next slide to show an adjusted LCOE for these projects. It's hard to compare them because of tax and other government benefits and questions about which projects are bearing the cost of transmission and which ones have socialized transmission. So NREL made an effort to do an apples to apples comparison, and you see that basically those projects line up in a pretty regular way. Sometimes there'll be a project done in more challenging mid-ocean conditions or with a lower wind speed for reasons of location. But by and large, these are excellent wind resources and in fairly favorable conditions in terms of ocean depth and mid-ocean conditions. The vineyard prices are highlighted because those are the only ones on this slide that are in the U.S. Vineyard is a joint venture of Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners and Avangrid. Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners is Magellan's joint venture partner in the California market. This does not show a couple of more recent U.S. projects, but I think the interesting feature of this slide, just big picture, is that you can see the slope of the best fit line between connecting those points. Right now, we're looking at prices in the neighborhood of $50 to $60 per megawatt hour, so 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour in the best projects in Europe. The Dogger Banks project is worth pausing on for a second. That was just announced recently, and it's a 3.6 gigawatt project about 100 kilometers off the UK in a very windy area with relatively shallow and favorable seabed conditions, so that they can support that project at that scale can support quite an expensive transmission solution, as well as higher O&M costs because of the distance to shore. These are some projections of what's going to happen over the coming years. As you can see, in end of 2018, the European Union is where the action has been. China is coming on. When the IEA did its analysis of what's coming between now and 2040, their central scenario showed Europe still somewhat ahead, but China having built a tremendous amount, and the Asia Pacific and the United States also really getting into the game in a big way. The U.S. number there from the IEA may be a little low. That's 30 gigawatts, and depending on how you assess the probability of completion of the projects that are in various stages of development on the East Coast now, you could come up with over 20 gigawatts in the pipeline. We'll get to a slide on the U.S. in a minute. So this is a BOEM map modified by NREL of all the lease areas and call areas, prospective lease areas off the U.S. coast. Concentration in the Northeast, where, as was indicated, the power prices are fairly high. It's also very difficult to get new transmission in from the West. It's easier. It's not easy, but it's easier to build subsea transition, then to bring high voltage lines in from, say, renewable resources in the ridge lines of the first range of the Appalachians. The text on the right gives you some indications of the prices for U.S. projects where developers with site control have won contract rights, and there's a steady decline. Some of those numbers may be a little out of line because the states which support the revenue streams have different appetites for cost efficiency and local content. We expect these prices to come down as the supply chain in the U.S. matures, but there's going to always be some variation depending on whether the state regulators and the state policymakers are looking at offshore wind as an economic development effort or as a low-cost power effort. These, by the way, are all bottom-fixed projects. The typical technology is a monopile. The current generation is about 8 meters across, pile driven into the seabed, and a tower mounted on top of that, and then a nacelle at the top of the tower, using a lift vessel that can lift a 300, what's now 300 or 400 ton nacelle to a hub height of 110 meters. It's getting larger as we and it pretty soon. Well, the projects that are in the pipeline now, many are being modeled for 14 megawatt turbines. The 12 megawatt generation, 10 to 12 megawatt generation is just now on the verge of deployment. These are different expert assessments of the U.S. Capacity development between now and 2030. They're not so far off. Bloomberg is a little lower than the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind and 4C Offshore, which is a large kind of consultancy and information seller in the offshore wind space. But they're coming out at 12 to 16 gigawatts of new capacity by 2030. This is from the Special Initiative report on the economics and economic development implications of offshore development on the East Coast. And the 70 billion is broken down here. The 70 billion estimate is broken down by components of the construction. A good rule of thumb for projects projects under development now, I think, is $2,500 to $3,500 per kilowatt installed capacity, so $2.50 to $3 a watt. There's some expectation that that'll come down a bit as the turbines get larger. That reduces the foundation cost, the unit foundation costs, and also the cabling and O&M costs. And that's one of the reasons why offshore turbines are much larger than land-based turbines. You can overcome the logistical challenges at sea of managing these massive machines. You really can't transport the nacelles or the blades for these large turbines on roads or railroads. This slide is getting to Magellan's specialty, which is the floating offshore market. And globally, I think that's the slide on the left, the World Bank slide, is interesting for showing all the areas where there are extremely good wind resources. Typically, the tropics, it's slower, and it requires better technology, more efficient technology to make a viable project there. But all those red and orange areas are pretty much viable with current turbine technology. And on the right slide, you'll see that in many of those areas where there are load centers near good offshore wind resources, it's deep water. All the normal areas are deep water. The anomalies are the areas where we've seen first generation projects because they're amenable to bottom fixed foundations. Here's some broad classes of floating foundation designs. There are now, depending on how you count it, roughly 60 designs that have been proposed and have reached at least some level of research. There's only a handful that have been deployed at full scale. The basic classes are a barge. The company that's leading that technology is a French company called Ideal. They have, I think, 3 now in the water at up to 6 megawatt scale. The semi-submersible has been done in Japan in what appear to be just one-off projects off Fukushima at a fairly large scale. They had a 7 megawatt turbine on one of those, but the leading company producing those foundations now is called Principal Power, was based in Seattle, now in California, and they have, I would guess, depending on how you count the various proposals, 50 or 100 megawatts in pretty far advanced in the development process. The issue with the semi-submersible, at least with the current design, is you really need a dry dock to assemble those, and a lot of welding hours. The company that won the contract for the biggest one so far estimated 250,000 welding hours per unit. And when you try to serialize a large project, that's a real challenge. The spar was pioneered by Statoil, now Equinor. It's essentially a big steel can with ballast at the bottom. The critical issue with respect to that technology is the depth that requires from the point of installation to the point of deployment. You need at least 70 meters draft all the way out, which works for a Norwegian fjord if you have a massive oil and gas barge that can lift, a floating barge with a crane that can lift to 110 meters, but it doesn't work in most places. So far, no one has produced a turbine that can be assembled horizontally and then put into vertical position in the ocean. And the final version, the final foundation class there is a TLT, where the foundation is buoyant and it's kept stable by tendons that connect to small pilings on the bottom. It's very stable. It's been done at a very large scale in the oil and gas industry. Trying to get the unit cost down in the offshore wind world is a challenge, but it may have a good run in Japan and other Asian markets where there's a premium placed on a small footprint without spread mooring lines to minimize the effect on the fishing industry. Quickly, this is a rundown on some of the leading floating foundation technologies. The one that Magellan is particularly optimistic about is CCL Offshore Technologies TetraSpar. We're technology agnostic in the sense that we'll use whatever's best when we have to decide for a project, but so far of what's on the horizon, we think that this is going to be the lowest cost and most efficient approach. When you look at floating wind costs, we're earlier on the learning curve for the foundations. This is an NREL slide from their most recent Offshore Wind Technologies report that kind of does a meta-analysis of different expert cost projections. And like most of the expert analysis we've seen, says that it won't be too long before floating wind is cost competitive with bottom fixed. The basic trade-off is you spend more on moorings and on materials for the foundation than you do with a monopile, but you end up spending way less on deployment vessels because the leading designs are assembled quayside and towed out with conventional tugboats to the deployment site. So you save a lot on mobilization, demobilization, and just the cost of these purpose-built vessels with large crews and phenomenal lifting capacity. capacity out in the ocean. This is a quick rundown on what the CCL Offshore Technologies line of products looks like. The key to this technology, and one of the reasons why we think it's going to be very important in the market in the years immediately ahead, is that all those components from the water level down come right out of wind tower manufacturing plants. And it's a very automated process, high quality, low cost, very competitive. About 100,000 units a year currently come out of wind tower manufacturing plants for land-based and offshore projects. So they're robot welding. They have robot welding and very careful quality control inside the factory. These can be shipped by conventional means to the dock and assembled quickly without welding, using pins quayside, and then towed from the quayside to the deployment site. So the projection is that this will allow for 2 foundations a week to be assembled from one harbor area without any special accommodations. I see that I need to wrap up quickly here. This is what a Tetris bar, or rather an SOT deployment site would look like. The first one of these is under fabrication now in the largest tower manufacturing plant in the world in Denmark, called Welcon, and it's scheduled for deployment off Norway, the same test site where the very first floating foundation, the Statoil Foundation, was deployed sometime in the summer of 2020. And that's a quick overview, and I'll be happy to answer questions when the presentations are finished. Thanks.
Thank you. We're now passing over to Kevin Lang.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. As was said, my name is Kevin Lang. I'm an attorney with Catchroyd in Albany. First, just a quick disclaimer. My comments today are mine and mine alone. They do not represent the positions of any of my clients. So please don't attribute anything I say to any of my clients. And I appreciate the opportunity to present to you today. Jeff went through the technology stuff, and I'm going to go through some of the regulatory issues. There we go. In the first couple of slides that I have, I've gone through some of the states that are currently actively looking at offshore wind and what their structure is. I would note on the East Coast that we could go all the way down from Maine almost to Florida, and virtually every state along the Atlantic seaboard is looking at offshore wind in some fashion. I don't have a slide on each and every state. When we get to the questions, if I can answer them, I will try. By my count, there are 6 states on the eastern seaboard that have already adopted formally certain procurement amounts of offshore wind, starting here with New York. Overall, based on information that I found on DOE's website and in other places, we have approximately 26 gigawatts of offshore wind currently in the pipeline along the eastern seaboard, more being looked at in California and Hawaii. Jeff mentioned a couple of the issues there, much deeper water on the West Coast than the East Coast. The Department of Energy has studied overall United States potential up to 86 gigawatts. Based on, again, some research that I've done, the current projection is that by 2026 in total, we'll have about 7.5 gigawatts of offshore wind that's installed. So turning to what the states are doing, offshore wind development from a regulatory perspective is a combination of state action and federal action. Federal action because, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, most of these are being developed in federal waters, not state waters. State action because someone needs to actually pay for it. In New York, we adopted earlier this year something called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I actually think I have that backwards. My apologies. It's actually the Community Leadership and Climate Protection Act. But this calls for 70% renewables by 2030 and as Catherine Lutein said a few minutes ago, 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. She mentioned that we presently have approximately 1,700 megawatts that is under contract, projected in service dates of 2024. NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, recently held a webinar on offshore wind in which they indicated expectations to continue doing state procurements of offshore wind through the 20s to reach our 9,000 megawatt goal. New York is slightly different, as you'll see in the next few slides, in that all of the offshore wind contracts in New York are being contracted directly through NYSERDA, and then each individual load serving entity, utility, energy service company, others would then do contracts with NYSERDA for their share of the offshore wind. The overall price is going to be socialized across the state, and NYSERDA has projected for the two projects a price of $25.14 per megawatt. Per megawatt hour. If we go to New Jersey, they've also taken statutory action, as you see here. I would note some of it was actually pretty recent. They were at 3,500 megawatts of offshore wind, and that has since been increased to 7,500. They have 1,100 megawatts under contract, and similar to New York in terms of the expected timeframes. Unlike New York, in New Jersey, the requirements were that every electric distribution company, every utility will contract directly with the offshore wind providers, all under the oversight of the Board of Public Utilities. As you can see here, theirs was a little bit earlier than New York's. They have a price, an OREC is an offshore wind renewable energy credit, basically is making up the difference between what they can sell power for in the marketplace and what it's going to cost them to develop and operate these facilities. So their price here is $46. As we move to Massachusetts, they also have statutory enactment there. This also recent development in Massachusetts, just a couple of months ago. They had a projection of 16 or a requirement of 1,600. That was their goal. They have now doubled that to 3,200 megawatts by 2035. They've also already started their procurement process in Massachusetts with 1,600 megawatts selected. Just like New Jersey, the contracting entities are directly with the utility companies, with the cost then passed through to utility ratepayers. In Connecticut, I only have a couple more of these. I didn't go through every state, as I mentioned. They have a statute as well to procure offshore wind. Their goal is 2,000 megawatts. Right now, they have selected about 1,000 megawatts of their 2,000. They're looking at a similar time frame. They've also proposed a couple of additional procurements. Unlike New York, which has said we're going to do them every year, Connecticut's going to do them every 2 years. The one thing I should mention with all of these dates that I'm going through is they are estimates. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which I'll get to in a minute, is required to do environmental impact statements for these projects. And recently with the Vineyard wind farm that Jeff talked about, the Bureau has required additional environmental impact statements, which are likely to delay most or all of these projects. So let's turn to the board. Board of Ocean Energy Management is part of the Department of the Interior. It governs offshore wind development. The outer continental shelf is defined as from 3 to 200 nautical miles offshore. State jurisdiction extends only 3 nautical miles. The reason why most of the wind farms are being developed in federal waters rather than state waters pertains to impacts from shore. There's a lot of concerns with what these things look like, and are they going to harm the viewshed when you're on the beach or when you're on beachside properties. When you put them further out to sea, you basically cannot see them from the shore. The board is required to approve lease rights for the development of offshore wind. Presently, the board has approved 15 leases. Of those, 6 projects are in the site assessment stage, the preliminary stages of offshore wind development. 9 leases are in what's called the construction operations plan stage. And this is when the developers are coming forth with their very, very specific plans for individual projects. I don't have it on the slide, but just to give you a sense of the process for folks that might be interested in this, the first step in the board's process is to identify areas that might be suitable for offshore wind development. Second, they determine whether or not there would be a competitive interest. At this point, there's competitive interest essentially in every area. If so, the board conducts a competitive solicitation to determine, and it's based mostly on price, to let leases for these areas. Once they've entered into the leases, they do an initial environmental and technical assessment of the leased area to determine whether it can support offshore wind and if there's any issues with sea life, with birds, with shipping, with fishing, etc. Once they've finished the site assessment, they then conduct a construction and operations plan. The developer does, that gets submitted to the BOEM, and then the construction operations plan is subjected to additional environmental review. Are there any issues with the specific manner in which an offshore wind farm is going to be developed? As Jeff went through a few minutes ago, there's lots of different techniques for mounting these to the seabed and for constructing them. They'll all have their own individual environmental impacts that then get studied. Just to also give you a sense of the time frame, the initial planning process, BOEM estimates at about 2 years. The leasing process, the competitive process, is 1 to 2 years. Site assessments can take anywhere from 1 to 5 years, and the construction process itself, or the construction review, excuse me, is approximately 2 years. In other words, siting and developing offshore wind is a very lengthy process. So, talked about the regulatory part. What are some of the key considerations that we have here is, what do you do once you've produced the power? The wholesale market considerations are, most of these projects, at least along the eastern seaboard where we have markets, will sell their output into the markets. They'll get paid the same price and operate the same way as any other supplier in the wholesale markets. They would be paid for their capacity, they get paid for their energy, and then the ORECs, or the offshore wind RECs, will make up the difference between the cost of offshore wind and what you get in the markets. One of the key issues, and Catherine laid out at the beginning, regulatory issues and pricing issues. Right now in most of the eastern markets, our pricing is based on the cost of gas. And right now the cost of gas is very low, so energy prices, from a consumer perspective, it's great, are very, very low. But generally, from a development perspective, it means that you need a higher subsidy. The other issue with offshore wind is it's not a dispatchable resource. Its capacity factors are only 30 to 50%, so you can't count on it, rely on it the same way that you can a gas-fired unit. I'm running a little bit low, so I'll speed up a little bit. Wanted to give you just a couple of general considerations that folks are thinking about for offshore wind from a regulatory perspective. And this is true in virtually every state. How much financial support is required from ratepayers, from customers? Right now, offshore wind is not cost competitive with other types of generation. And so that's why we're seeing state-driven efforts pretty much all along the eastern seaboard. Other things that are very important now are employment opportunities. There is projections that offshore wind is going to lead to tens of thousands of jobs, not just construction, but maintenance jobs, back office jobs, everything else. Those are very significant considerations. Supply chain investments is very broad. As Jeff indicated, the size of these things is such that you have to do most of the construction in ports right along the ocean. That's going to require building new facilities, manning those facilities, etc. And then you have the whole procurement of all of the parts. In New York and certainly in the Northeast right now, There are very significant efforts being undertaken to look at what the impact is on both shipping and commercial fishing. When you anchor these things to the seabed, it takes up very large spaces. Those spaces can no longer be used for fishing because of entanglements. So those issues are being studied very, very carefully. Mitigation is being developed to ameliorate some of these impacts. And then finally, as I note here in research and development, that the federal government and many of the states are pooling resources to understand what the implications are for offshore wind, which is still very new in the United States, what the different technologies are and what best practices are. Onshore siting considerations. So Catherine alluded in the initial part to transmission considerations. In many instances, when people quote prices of offshore wind, they're only talking about the transmission that goes from the platform to where it connects to the shore, or the offshore piece of it. Two different types of transmission. You can have radial, which is where you have a transmission line that runs from each and every tower to a central location, either just offshore or onshore, or what's called a trunk line, where all of the individual platforms connect to a main transmission line, and then that extends from out in the ocean onto shore. But once you get to shore, there are a series of issues of how do you connect into the power grid. Most areas along the seashores have never been developed for electricity because there was no need. So you don't have robust substations or transmission lines. So there's a lot of reinforcement up and down the East Coast that is probably going to be required to support offshore wind. Those costs have not really been talked about very much. New York is looking at transmission, but hasn't made any decisions on what should happen. The first two projects, Equinor and Ørsted, are being done on a radial basis. But when New York does look, and this is relatively true for every state in transmission siting, very similar to any kind of environmental review, you're looking at the impact of the location, wildlife, fisheries, etc., what all of those potential impacts are. And then coupled with that, you have NIMBY. Any of you that have been involved in development, I'm sure, are familiar with the not in my backyard local opposition who just don't want to see these large-scale projects. Is a significant concern, and the transmission costs can be very substantial. So the last issue here, costs and payments, it's very important to balance those costs and the payments associated with them with the overall project costs, so that we're balancing the need to serve the state public policies, as well as not drive electric prices up so high that they are not affordable for most people. And with that, I'll come to an end and again say thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I believe we will now be opening it up to questions.
Hi, this is Catherine. I actually have a question for Jeff. Why are offshore wind turbines currently generating less power than hoped?
Well, there's two parts to that. In some respects, they're generating more power than hoped 5 years ago. The capacity factors of the larger new generation turbines have been increasing with the same, even in the same wind regimes. So now some of the projects are seeing over 50% capacity factors, and the capacity factors for even moderate wind regimes are in the mid to high 40s. So there's the good news side of it, and then I think what you're alluding to is press accounts a few weeks ago from Ørsted's reassessment of wake effects and the sort of first tier backup effects, and that their determination based on a lot of data from a lot of projects, they're the largest offshore wind developer and operator in the world, showed that the modeling had underestimated the wake effects and the sort of the resistance at the first rank of turbines in a wind farm, and the error rate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2%. So it's a significant issue, but in relation to the broader, longer term trends, I don't think it's anything like a showstopper for the industry. But I guess to elaborate a little more, the wake effect is the loss in energy for the second and later ranks of turbines, and the effect on the first rank is just the aerodynamics of the wind hitting the resistance of the blades, and both those have been modeled quite extensively, because the 20,000 installed megawatts is probably $100 billion or $80 billion of capital. So it wasn't as if people hadn't been working these problems, but the operational data showed that it was apparently not as it was a more severe problem than they had modeled. There's also been some work. I'll just make one more point. There's been some work on ways of tweaking the alignment of the turbines and the yaw controls on the blades or on the nacelles, so that you minimize wake effects. And there's about a 1 or 2% gain, is what I've read, from sophisticated use of the controls to subtly adjust the angles, and also to improve the layout to reduce particularly wake effects. So there's a pretty serious number crunching exercise to figure out the optimum operational rules and the optimum configuration to get the maximum power out of the second and later ranks of turbines.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate your response. I have a question for Kevin. What can the states do to accelerate the procurement of offshore wind at a price that will not break the bank?
Interesting question. So I think one thing that we're already starting to see them do is coordinate and collaborate, rather than every state going it alone. We're starting to see right now on the research and development, and even on some of the mitigation type studies, where they're pooling their resources. And as we get more down the line, as more people are building these, as Jeff noted on one of his slides, we're already seeing the prices drop. We're not as low in the States as they are in Europe, because the market is more robust in Europe. But I think that you're going to see, with greater penetration and greater acceptance, the pricing coming down. But the transmission issue is also very important. And when we look at offshore wind siting, there should be consideration of putting these in locations where they're going to connect, where there might be existing fossil-based plants that are shutting down or have shut down, and so there's readily available transmission capacity, or building it in areas that are more conducive to building transmission. For example, you don't necessarily want to build it right in the middle of a beachfront community, is your interconnection point. You also have to be sensitive to wetlands and marsh areas, which are very sensitive environmental areas. So there's a lot more thought, and again, those are things that NYSERDA and DOE in New Jersey, Massachusetts are all looking at right now. I think, though, for a while, offshore wind is still going to remain very expensive, much more expensive than more established technologies like a gas turbine.
Sharon, do we have any questions that were asked on the line?
We do. So the first one is, what is the average electricity unit cost in the USA, both industrial and commercial?
Catherine, I don't know if you know, I'd have to look up what a nationwide average is. New York is definitely above average, as is most of the Northeast.
Right, I would say there's quite a range. In Hawaii, it's something like 15 or 17 cents, just the wholesale power price. In states that have cheap gas and have built out a lot of gas turbines, I think the estimate for a new gas turbine plant, a state-of-the-art plant with access to shale gas is probably 5 cents a kilowatt hour, maybe 4. So there's quite a range. The EIA puts out state by state fact sheets on power prices, on wholesale power prices.
And I think the point is that we're seeing the offshore wind being developed in the areas in which there is high cost electric prices. You know, the offshore wind is not cheap by any means. You know, it is dropping in price, but it becomes more palatable in areas where you're seeing really high electric prices.
And where there are state policies addressing greenhouse gases. You know, it doesn't appear that we're going to have anything like a nationwide carbon price, but we have states acting to try to approximate what a carbon pricing policy would do by establishing renewable portfolio standards, and then sometimes special provisions for new technologies to bring them into the mainstream. OREX is one. A lot of states had SREX for solar when solar was well above market. So I think it's a combination of where power prices are high, where the offshore wind resources are favorable, and where states are pursuing greenhouse gas reduction policies.
So just to give you a little bit of perspective, this is Kevin speaking. I did a quick search, and it looks like the nationwide average price is somewhere around 13 to 15 cents for an all-in energy price. New York is a little bit higher than that. In the context of the 1,700 megawatts that NYSERDA has now contracted for in New York, they have done some calculations and estimated that the impact on that will be 73 cents per residential customer in the state per month. For commercial industrial, it's going to be significantly larger than that. But to give you kind of a ballpark, so 1,700 megawatts, 73 cents. I would note, though, that doesn't include the cost of onshore transmission, which isn't going to equal the cost of offshore wind, but is probably going to be maybe a fifth to a third of the cost, depending on what all is going to be required, and we don't know that yet in New York. Next question, Sharon.
Okay, it says, are wind farms being paired with storage in any meaningful way in the Northeast?
Not yet, to my knowledge. Jeff, do you know of any?
Yeah, I don't know of any in the Northeast. There's a fair amount in Northern Europe, and Ørsted has announced an initiative for hydrogen from excess wind. Big picture, the existing storage, you've probably seen how much cheaper lithium-ion storage is getting and read about relatively large new installations of lithium-ion batteries. And that works pretty well with solar, because if you have a good solar resource, you know, like in the Southwest, it's a diurnal cycle. And if you can extend the solar day by 4 hours, you get a lot more, you can bring in a lot more load. Wind, offshore and onshore, doesn't fit with lithium-ion batteries very well, because its variability is tied to weather cycles that are longer than diurnal. So 4 hours of storage doesn't help you much, and it gets to be very expensive to build enough battery power to span, you know, a 1 week weather cycle that has periods of high and low wind. There are promising storage technologies in the works that I think will make land-based and offshore wind coupled with storage more viable. That's going to be especially important in northern climates where the fit of solar to load is really poor seasonally. So in other words, even if you can build solar in Denmark or in Massachusetts for 4 cents a kilowatt hour, if you try to get to a very high penetration renewable electrical grid, then you end up with solar that produces maybe a third or a fourth as much in the winter as it does in the summer, your winter load is maybe 80% or 90% of your summer load in the northern climates. So wind in a decarbonized electrical system has to be a bigger part of the picture in Northern Europe and in places like the Northeast and upper Midwest in the U.S.
Thank you. Next question. By rule of thumb, what speed of wind is needed to generate 1 megawatt?
Oh, here's Jeff.
Well, I guess it requires a more than a one number answer. For land-based wind, with current technology, I think you can produce at a competitive price, maybe with 7 or 7.5 meters per second. Projects get built in Michigan, I know, with a 7 meter per second wind resource. You wouldn't build offshore for that resource because it's more expensive per megawatt of installed capacity. So you need to take advantage of the higher wind speeds at good offshore sites to make the projects viable. I would say probably 8 or 8.5 with current technology is where people are doing projects and up. Some of the wind off the Northeast and off Northern California and Southern Oregon is as fast as good as anywhere in the world, over 10 meters per second, and that's that really produces more per unit of installed capacity. You probably get to a 55% capacity factor with some of those in some of those areas. So with the new land-based technology, you can get down to lower wind speeds, but those are not 1 megawatt units. Those are probably 3 or 4 or 5 megawatt units. And offshore, we'll see where it bottoms out, but I don't expect anytime soon for people to be looking at areas where the wind speed is lower than 8 or 8.5 meters per second.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have, with respect to the safety of marine life, what measures are in place to protect these ecosystems from transmission failure?
I know that's an issue that is currently being studied by NYSERDA, DOE, and other states. I don't know, Jeff, I don't know if you know if there's anything that's been identified yet.
I'm not aware of big concerns about transmission failure, like a short out. I think that there's a quick cutoff if there ever were like an anchor snag of an export cable. That's not what the fisheries experts we talked to worry about. There was some concern about EMF years ago, and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has done some studies, and I don't think that there's much to that. There are a few species that seem to be more sensitive, but it hasn't been a big issue to my knowledge in any of the environmental reviews in Europe or in the U.S. There are concerns about benthic life and transmission when the cable burying disrupts sensitive areas, and that factors into the routing of the cable routes.
The other thing I just wanted to add is some of you may have read that there have been issues with high voltage direct current cables where they've leaked what's called dielectric fluid that's used to cool them. But modern technology has moved away from fluids to solid materials, and a lot of the modern cables don't have any fluid in them. So even if they get hit, they're not going to leak anything out into the environment. As Jeff said, there's automatic shutdowns of them, and it's just a matter of sending divers down to effect repairs.
Yeah, I would say, I think actually none of the cable manufacturers, either inter-array or export cable, the 33 or 66 kV inter-array cables or the larger export cables that go from the substation to the shore, none of those, to my knowledge, now have any fluid in them. They're all solid state.
Okay, thank you. Another one along similar lines, and we have someone else who's asking almost the same question too. With respect to migratory birds that travel above the water bodies, what measures are in place on offshore wind to protect them?
Again, I'll just start and note that this has been a very significant issue raised by environmental groups, even environmental protection agencies at the state level. That issue is being researched right now by the consortium of the eastern states. I don't know if they've come up with any specific mitigation measures yet. It's also an issue that's constantly being reviewed for onshore wind because it's an issue there as well.
Okay, thank you. And then we have, let me see. How is transmission of wind power to the shore regulated?
So right now in the United States, it really isn't because we're not there yet. I know in New York, I know in New England, there have been conversations about that. The one question that keeps coming up is whose jurisdiction is it? It's certainly the federal government's jurisdiction. It's not really under state jurisdiction, but there's also a question of whether it will fall in the organized markets in New York, the New York Independent System Operator, in New England, ISO New England. What we've seen in Europe is that most of those offshore transmission lines are privately owned and controlled. In the United States, there's really been no decisions made on a large scale on what we're going to do for transmission. Is it an individual line directly to shore from each windmill, or is it everything connecting into a trunk line, which will have some impact on it? There's a few developers that have gone to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and raised similar questions. They have not been answered yet.
Okay, thank you.
I would just add a couple of observations to that. One is, if you're talking about the physical transmission siting, there's a state role with respect to state waters the first 3 miles from the coast. There's also a state role under the Coastal Zone Management Act for collateral effects on the coastal zone. And then the landlord, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, regulates the transmission from a physical perspective all the way out to the substation offshore. When you're talking about the regulation of plug-in, it's typically in the U.S. Independent Service Organization, the ISO, that controls interconnection into the grid, and that's a world unto itself.
Okay, thank you. We do have a couple more questions, but looking at the time, I think we're almost out of time. So the two of you that have typed your questions in there, if you would please send those to me at sharon@aeecenter.org. I will be happy to pass those along and get those answered for you. One person is in particular wanting to know more about California offshore wind programs. So if you send that to me, I will forward that and hopefully we'll be able to get you an answer. So just before we wrap up today, I would just like to let everybody know that our US public training schedule is available online. It's open for registration at this time, so please feel free to take a look at what we have on offer for 2020. And we do have 4 events coming up in 2020 also. So as you can see on your screen, we have AEE East, West, let me just go back to the previous one, East, West, World, and Europe. And you can see the information right there, and that's all also available on our website. If you are interested in attending AEE East, please be aware that we currently have early bird pricing for our members of $95, and that's only valid until the 1st of January. So if you are interested in that, please think about doing that in the next few days. Finally, we are currently scheduling our AEE member webinars for 2020. I have received a few questions on this via email. I am working with several presenters to get that schedule together. We do not have anything currently posted on the website, but please keep checking back at the web address that you see on screen right now, and we will get those posted as soon as we possibly can. Thank you everyone for attending today, and a huge thank you to Catherine, Jeff, and Kevin for your expertise today and for agreeing to present to the AEE members. And on that note, I'd just like to wish everybody a happy holiday season and goodbye for now. Any final words, sorry, from any of our presenters? That was my final word, but anybody else like to say
I'm
anything?
sorry, Chair. I just want to note real quick, my apologies to everybody. I had referred to it as the Board of Ocean Energy Management. I corrected that on my slide. It's the Bureau, not the Board.
Thank you.
Want to make sure I got that right.
And this is Catherine. This is the third this year in a series in which we took a look at energy policy and its impact on carbon reduction. I really appreciate Kevin and Jeff's expertise. All I do is pick the topic, and then I find the right people to chat with you about it. So thanks a lot. I appreciate your participation.
And this is Jeff. Thanks everyone for their interest and attention.
Okay, on that note, thank you everyone, and I will close the webinar. See you all in January.
Happy holidays all.